Hi, my name's Alex Koiter. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment here at Brandon University. My pronouns are he, him.
And I'm Tami Malone. I'm a undergrad student at Brandon University in biology, and my pronouns are she, her.
Ready to talk about all things riparian,
Yes,
grazing, and phosphorus?
I think so.
Awesome.
Okay, my first question. What is the main question your paper addresses about riparian grazing and phosphorus loss, and why is it important?
Excellent. So let's start off by just kind of talking about a bit about what a riparian area is and kind of where we can find them. So riparian areas are generally, kind of perennial vegetation surrounding bodies of water. So these bodies of water could be streams, they could be rivers, they could be lakes, they could be wetlands, they could be prairie potholes. So anything that kind of holds water, think about kind of that ring or that strip of vegetation kind of running alongside it. And so we find them everywhere, right? In all types of environments here in Manitoba and all across Canada and across the world. So why focus on riparian areas? So riparian areas, they provide a lot of ecological goods and services. So from a wildlife perspective, they can be very important habitat. So here in the prairies, especially in the prairie pothole region, these riparian areas around these little wetlands serve as really important nesting habitat for migrating birds and waterfowl and songbirds. They are also really good at being little refuges for insects and pollinators. So yeah, they provide a really important ecological role. So my particular interest in riparian areas really stems from a water quality perspective in these agro ecosystems. So agriculture plays a role in phosphorus loading into surface water, right? So phosphorus is a required nutrient for plant growth. And in many aquatic systems, phosphorus is often the kind of the rate limiting nutrient. So that means any extra phosphorus that enters into these systems quickly gets taken up by the plants. And this can actually result in some pretty poor water quality. So if we think about Lake Winnipeg, for example, right, it has over the last probably last couple decades has experienced some pretty large and severe algal blooms. And a lot of that is driven by excess phosphorus. And one of the contributors is agricultural ecosystems. Not by any stretch of the means the only one, but it is one of them. And so my research program is looking at, well, how can we manage agricultural areas to basically reduce excess phosphorus loading in an effort to kind of protect water quality. So, in many farms and in many agroecosystems, riparian areas are often maintained or established as basically a way to stop phosphorus from leaving the field and entering into the surface water. So, for example, runoff and any associated phosphorus will kind of reach this riparian area and will soak into the soils, and it'll be taken up by the plants growing there, and that basically traps it there, and it prevents it from moving into the surface water where it can cause things like algal blooms and eutrophication. But here in Canada and Manitoba especially, we have very strong seasonality, right? So we move from right now where it's nice and warm and sunny to some pretty cold winter conditions. And so what we've noticed is that most of the phosphorus loss tends to occur in the spring during the snow melt. And so during this period where we have a lot of water moving across the landscape, our riparian areas aren't all that great at actually trapping and stopping that phosphorus. So when we have this snow melt, the most of the vegetation is still dormant, so they're not actively taking up nutrients. And in many cases, the soils themselves are still frozen. And so there's very limited infiltration. So the soils aren't really available to kind of soak up that extra phosphorus that's running across the landscape. So while these features are really great, they don't work as well during that kind of key period uh, during the snow melt. The other kind of issue that we've started to recognize is that the vegetation in these riparian areas can also act as a source of phosphorus. So when they're actively growing, they are basically a sink, so they trap and store nutrients. But as they kind of go into dormancy and they die off and they go freeze and they thaw, freeze, thaw, they actually start to release a lot of that phosphorus. And again, that phosphorus can then move off the landscape and into our surface water, where it can cause some significant issues. So that's kind of a little bit about riparian areas and phosphorus in our kind of unique climatic situation. The other part of this project was actually looking at cattle grazing. So if we look at a typical farm here in southwestern Manitoba, those riparian areas, they actually occupy a fairly significant total of the area of a farm. Right, so they are an important part of a working farm. In particular, during times of drought, these riparian areas tend to stay a little bit wetter than the surrounding areas, and so they can actually serve as a very important source of forage during those times. And so from a cattle production perspective, right, they can be a key resource. So ultimately, what we were mostly interested in is kind of asking the question, can we use cattle to remove phosphorus from the riparian areas and kind of reduce that potential for loss during that spring snow melt? So that's kind of the overall kind of picture we had. We had a couple kind of more specific questions. So one of the questions we wanted to ask is, well, in these riparian areas, where exactly is the phosphorus? And so part of this project, we actually identified kind of 4 unique sources or pools of phosphorus. So we can start kind of at the very, very top where we have that kind of living vegetation or that biomass, right? So think about the kind of the green grass that grows every year. Underneath that, we actually have a litter layer. And so this litter layer is basically previous year's growth of grass that has died, and it's basically providing a bit of a thatch layer. Below that, we actually have a bit of an organic layer. And so if we take that litter, that dead grasses, over time it actually starts to decompose, and you actually end up with a bit of a layer of compost. And then below that, that is where we actually get into the soils, into the actual mineral part of the soils. And so we were very interested in saying, well, how much phosphorus is in each of those 4 kind of unique pools of phosphorus? We also had a kind of another question. So that's kind of looking at it in the vertical direction. We also want to look at it kind of more of a longitudinal. And so we looked at how those sources of phosphorus changed as we moved from directly beside the water and as we moved up through the riparian area towards the actual farm fields. So that's kind of how we looked at, well, where is the phosphorus? How much phosphorus is there? Second kind of more specific question is, well, how do those sources of phosphorus change in response to grazing? Right? So this idea is, well, if we get these cattle into these areas and they eat some of this grass, are we actually removing some of that phosphorus? Right? Once we remove it from the system, there's less potential and there's less phosphorus to be able to be lost during that kind of key spring snowmelt period. So in order to kind of look at this, we identified 4 riparian areas around some small wetlands or prairie potholes. And each of these riparian areas we divided into 4 square plots. And so in each of these riparian areas, we had a control plot, which is where we did nothing. So that was kind of our reference point. We had what we called a grazing treatment. So we would let cattle in. They would kind of munch on the grass, and then we remove them. We also had a high density grazing. In this case, we actually added in some additional cattle. And so we actually intensified the grazing with the idea that more cattle would eat more of that kind of vegetation and biomass. And then lastly, our last treatment was basically we mowed the lawn. And so we took in a tractor with a mowing attachment, and we actually mowed it, and we actually just raked it out of the plot. So again, there was that removal, just like the cattle, but without the actual cows. So those were kind of our kind of 4 treatments, and we replicated those 4 treatments across those 4 riparian areas. And so what we did is we measured phosphorus in all those kind of key areas before we let the cattle in and before we mowed, and again after they were done. And so what we ended up doing was we had these before and these we after samples, and it allows us to kind of say, okay, Was there a gain in phosphorus due to grazing, or was there a loss of phosphorus due to grazing? So we repeated this experiment over 3 years. We were able to kind of get some, within year and between year sense of kind of how variable these systems really are. And the way we measure this phosphorus in the lab is we actually took our sample and we basically extracted it using water. And the idea of using water as an extractant to basically extract the phosphorus from the vegetation, from the litter, or from the organic, or from the soils, was basically to kind of mimic what would happen when water is running across this landscape during the spring snow melt. And so that's what we used for our measure of phosphorus.
Which extracted more phosphorus from the area with the grazing or the rotary mower?
So by and large, what we found was that the mowing, followed by kind of the vegetation removal, was probably the most effective. But the high density grazing wasn't that far behind.
Okay. Well, because I'm just wondering now, like, would like harvesting hay, is that going to remove phosphorus from the landscape?
It certainly does. Or when we harvest it from these riparian areas and feed the cattle elsewhere on the farm, we're basically taking phosphorus from this riparian area
And just moving it?
and putting it somewhere else, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So again, if you're trying to grow crops and you're trying to grow hay or other forages, right, you do want to replenish these nutrients as well.
What are the key findings of the paper, and did anything surprise you during the analysis?
So first was the patterns we observed. That was kind of neat. So what we really saw was that biomass in litter, so kind of that very kind of top portion of the phosphorus, it contained a considerable amount of phosphorus. And historically, we've kind of often kind of ignored those parts of the landscape, right? We tend to focus on the soils, how much phosphorus is in the soils. But more recently, we've been looking at the vegetation on the landscape itself. So in those riparian areas, we were looking at the perennial grasses, but there's also been some really excellent work recently looking at things like, well, what about the crop residues that are left behind after harvest? How much phosphorus is in there? Or the use of cover crops. So again, how much phosphorus is in those cover crops, and what is the potential and what is the risk for loss during the spring snowmelt? And it turns out these are really kind of key sources that we really, really should not be ignoring. And so we really saw kind of a really neat vertical stratification and very kind of unique layering of phosphorus near the surface. The thing we really saw was that the amount of phosphorus in that litter and biomass really changed depending whether you were kind of right near the edge of the water versus if you were kind of next to the edge of the field. And so we saw a lot more phosphorus kind of closer to the water's edge. And I think this is primarily due to the fact it's just a little bit wetter there. And so the vegetation is just a little bit more prolific. And so it's basically a numbers game, right? So the concentration itself may not be that different, but there is just more of it, right? Because there's moisture is no longer a limiting factor, right? But as we kind of move up, it gets a little bit drier. And so we tend to see a little less grasses. On the flip side, if we look at the amount of phosphorus in the soils, we actually see the exact opposite. So we actually see more phosphorus in the soils right next to the edge of the field and less as we move towards the soil. And I think a lot of that has to do with, well, where is this phosphorus coming from? Well, it's coming from upslope, right? It's coming from the farm field. And so as it moves from the farm field towards these riparian areas, as soon as it hits the riparian area, right, that soil right there, that kind of where that field and riparian meet, right, that's where most of it's being soaked up by the soils, and so we tend to see that. So that was kind of in itself quite surprising. The other kind of really neat thing, and you kind of touched on this before, right, is that high grazing, that high density grazing, worked very similar to the mowing treatment. Right? So it really reduced the amount of phosphorus in that kind of vegetation layer, which was great because that means there's less phosphorus to then move through and into the surface water. So that's great. But what we what we also saw was that we didn't actually see any change in the other sources of phosphorus. And that was a little bit surprising. I kind of expected to see a bit of an increase in the amount of phosphorus in the soils, particularly because as these cattle are eating the vegetation and the phosphorus associated with it, right, there's also phosphorus coming out the other end, right? So there's additions of manure and urine, which should be adding sources of phosphorus to the soil and to those other pools. But we really did not detect a significant increase. Last kind of surprising thing that we saw was how variable both in space these sources of phosphorus, right? So I talked about kind of from water's edge to the field edge being there, right? We see that gradient, but even on a smaller scale. So if we were to sample here, take a step to the left, take another sample, we can see very, very different values, right? And some of that may be related to, right, the presence of cattle. So whether we hit a urine patch or not, we're going to get very, very different values. And so, right, we see this a huge amount of variability. And that variability, that large variability, really makes it a little tricky to detect small changes, right? And so that may explain why we weren't able to really detect a change in those other sources of phosphorus, right? Just because it was so variable.
Were the fields getting fertilizer applications during the testing?
Um, Not in this particular case, or not during our study period, but certainly in the past and in the
Yeah.
history of this farm, almost certainly. It is currently the farm we did this research at is currently a beef cattle farm, so they grow forages, perennial and annual forages.
Yeah.
But prior to that, they were basically a cereal and oilseed farm, and of course, they would follow your general recommendations for fertilizer to basically maintain crop yield and crop quality. And even in some of these forage systems, especially particularly the annual ones, again, they're almost certainly following standard agronomic practices.
Did funding from the BURC help expand the scope of the study, particularly in terms of phosphorus analysis?
So the Brandon University Research Committee funding really allowed us to expand the scope of this project. When the idea was kind of first being developed, we were really focused on kind of that very top layer, the vegetation, the kind of the green and growing grass, what the cattle are actually grazing on. This additional funding from the research committee allowed us to actually look at those other three sources of phosphorus. And what that really allowed us to do is actually get a much more comprehensive view of 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 phosphorus in these kind of unique riparian areas. And so a lot of that additional funding went to phosphorus analysis because there's, as we'll kind of find out, it's a lot of work to kind of process these samples and then to kind of do the actual phosphorus analysis is a considerable amount of work.
The paper was developed in collaboration with regional partners and conducted at a working research farm. How did those real world settings influence the results?
So we had two fantastic partners. We partnered with the Manitoba Association of Watersheds. So that's where we really are focusing on water quality, basically management. And we also then partnered with the Manitoba Beef and Forage Initiative. So the Watershed Association really has a goal of working with producers to develop and test and promote practices that help address water quality. And so that's where this kind of project came in, right? It was really kind of asking these questions. Well, can we use cattle to basically address water quality issues? Because historically, cattle were kind of viewed as the problem, and they certainly can be, right? The historically and still now, a lot of times riparian areas are fenced off to keep cattle out. And by and large, that can be a good thing, right? Because cattle, on a hot summer day, right, they want to stay cool. They need access to water, right? So they often would access these riparian areas to get a drink of water, to eat the nice forage there, right? But as they're there, right? There are, there's the addition of manure and urine, sometimes directly into the water courses. We had mentioned a little bit about how these riparian areas are a little bit wetter than the surrounding area. So there's also some concerns about cattle basically compacting these areas, right? When the soil is really soft, right? They're very large animals, and so they can do a lot of disturbance to these to the soils there. Of course, they also may kind of interfere with some of the other kind of ecological goods and services. So we talked about habitat, for example, right? So if we want to maintain good habitat, we do need to kind of control access, cattle access to these areas. This project took place at the Manitoba Beef and Forage Initiative's research farm just north of Forest, Manitoba. And so they were key to kind of getting this project up and running, right? So they were the ones that were provided me with access to these wonderful riparian areas, and they were also fantastic in terms of providing the cattle, which were kind of a key component to that. And so the awesome crew there, they were responsible for helping me fence off these areas and moving cattle from location to location. So one of the things that kind of comes out with working with these regional partners is a bit of a bit more of an idea of how these projects can scale up, or perhaps not scale up in many situations. So one thing that became very apparent with this project is that there is a considerable um, labor cost in terms of moving these cattle from place to place. So in this particular research project, we focused on very short-term grazing in the fall, right? As we chose the fall to basically reduce the issues of compaction and things like that, because those areas are a little bit drier. Um, but there is a considerable amount of effort to basically move cattle from one area to another to another. There's also a financial cost, right? So there is fencing involved. So if we want to keep cattle in a particular area, we either need permanent fencing, or in our case, we used temporary fencing. So again, even the setup, so there's the capital cost of the actual equipment, but there's also the cost of setting up the fences and removing them and letting them in and out. And so by working with these partners, it really kind of gave us a sense of kind of all the kind of inner workings of this. And so as we start to move this research forward, those are going to be really important considerations for us, right? These farms are businesses, and so they do need to be looking at the cost of labor and infrastructure.
The data analysis and publication are all openly accessible. Why was that openness important for this research, and how do you hope others will use what you've shared?
Yeah, so recently I've been much more interested in basically open science and reproducible science. And this project is kind of one of the first that I've had the pleasure of working on, where everything, with the exception of the peer review process for the publication, is open and is reproducible. So there are a couple kind of really important reasons why I'm I'm focusing on making this research kind of open and reproducible. So first is transparency and this idea of reproducibility, right? By providing open access to the raw data, and to the actual analyses that we used, it allows other researchers to basically verify my findings, right? I have spelled out the recipe, I have given them the data, they can reproduce my work, and that builds trust and transparency, right? So they're able to replicate my methods, and by doing so, it's a bit easier to kind of build on the work I've done, right? So they could take my data and put it into a larger data set to look at, well, here's what happened in Manitoba. Well, what's happening in other provinces, right? So how does it compare to Saskatchewan, Ontario, or other places, Canada, or even across the globe, right? So by having this kind of transparency, it really strengthens the credibility and integrity of the scientific research. So another one is collaboration, right? When I make things open and accessible, right, others can use it and say, "Hey, that was a really neat thing you've done. Let's work together." Right? Let's make this even better. Let's expand it. Let's do all these kind of cool things. But that's only really possible if it's available. Another one is public trust and accountability. A lot of the work we do here at Brandon University and other research institutions across Canada is often done with public funds, right? And I think we have an obligation to make our data and to make our science accessible and available. Really makes it available to anyone that has a stake in the science we're doing. We want to make informed decisions. We need to have data to make those decisions based on, right? And the easier we make it to access that data, I think the better we are in terms of making good decisions. And then the last one is it makes sharing faster and easier, right? No one has to send me an email or pick up the phone and say, "Hey, Alex, can I get the data? Can I ask you some questions about what you did or didn't do?" It's all there, right? I'm always happy to add extra details if needed, but hopefully what I've made available and accessible is everything that they would need to know, right? And so by making it publicly available, anyone within Manitoba has access to it, and really anyone across the world has access to it, right? There are lots of places in the world that have a similar climate to Manitoba, right? They have similar agricultural ecosystems and similar practices. And so by making this available, right, they can say, "Oh, well, how did it work in Manitoba? Maybe it'll work here." So thank you. So Tami, you've been integral to this project. And so I now have a couple questions about you, kind of about your involvement in the project itself. So you've been working as a research assistant in my as part of my research group for a number of years, like I think 3 years now. So which is fantastic. So my first question for you is how did you first get involved with this research group, and what drew you to it? So kind of what is your kind of personal story or journey?
Well, after my first year at BU, I definitely wanted some more like experience in the field of science versus other jobs I'd had in the past. So I was taking your class, and you said you needed an assistant, so I applied and I got the position. And yeah, I stuck with it for 3 years.
Yeah, so it couldn't have been that bad, right? Awesome. So you were heavily involved in kind of refining the lab techniques. We talked a little bit about the water extraction and the phosphorus. So you were really responsible for doing a lot of that analysis. So what was that process like, and did anything surprise you? And my last question is, how did it compare to your coursework?
It was definitely more independent than my coursework. And things weren't necessarily spelled out the way they are in, say, a lab that you would do for a class, because we had several different SOPs that we were trying to combine to do the testing and like create our own standard to test against.
Because I mean, we use the facilities that we have. So again, we have a different lab setup than our friends and collaborators. And so again, you were key at kind of taking those ideas and then basically applying them to our own facilities. You also helped me write and prepare the scientific publication. Um, so as a co-author, what did you learn about how the scientific papers are shaped kind of behind the scenes? So I suspect in classes you often see and read the final product, but you were involved from basically ground all the way through to the publication.
Well, I think it was surprising just how long the peer review process takes. Like, it's a very long, arduous process. It took probably twice as long to get peer reviewed as it did for you to write the paper. So I guess it makes you realize that what you're reading in class, how much work actually goes into producing something that will be seen by the public eye.
Yeah, that peer review process, our peers definitely went through it with a fine tooth comb. And yeah, I think that's kind of an important part of this. Builds trust in kind of the work we've done, but also they were kind of these reviewers also kind of helped us identify some of the shortcomings of our approach, and they also really helped us with kind of clarifying and making sure that what we'd written was understandable by kind of a broad audience as well. Our last question for you: Looking back, how has being part of this research team and seeing the paper published influenced your future goals or view of science?
Just the sheer amount of work that goes into answering any novel question you may have regarding like because you could just be driving by a field and be like, well, what's better, cattle grazing or mowing this field? What's going to get more phosphorus out of it? But it took 3 years of data collection and a summer of analysis before the question could even be answered.
So would you recommend think about the students who are going to be entering in their first year in September? Again, lots of faculty on campus are off to recruit summer research assistants. What would you say to an incoming first year student?
That you should apply to be a research assistant because it's a good experience and it's good to contribute to like whatever field of science you're interested in and kind of see how things are done.
Awesome. Okay, so you can find me on Blue Sky at Alex-Koiter. You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at again Alex_Koiter. I'm also have a GitHub profile. My handle is Alex-Koiter. There is a research project repository, which can be found at my GitHub account. So github.com/alex-koiter/riparian-grazing-manuscript. And there's also a research project website, and that can be found at alexkoiter.ca/riparian-grazing-manuscript. And there's also a data repository, or a Dryad one, and that has a crazy DOI. So doi.org/10.5061/dryad.nzs7h4526. Thanks, Tami, so much for joining me today. It was fantastic. Again, thank you so much for all your help over the last couple of years in making this project come to fruition. And thanks to everyone for watching.